Hi everyone, my name is Laura Wisse and today I'll be talking about T1-ASHS quality control or QC. And I wanted to thank Sandy, Emily and Annika before I start because they all helped putting this presentation together. So before I go into it, I just wanted to mention ASHS stands for Automated Segmentation of Hippocampal Subfields. This is kind of an outdated term as it also actually includes pericampal gyrus subregions, and in a newer version it will also include amygdala. The original paper presenting ASHS is shown on the left here. For T1-ASHS, it's shown on the right, and both are published in Human Hip Brain Mapping in case you want to look at those. So I also just wanted to mention some resources. So the software, both T1-ASHS that we're talking about today, but also T2-ASHS are publicly available. You can download them here. And actually for both, new releases will be coming out. So stay tuned for that. And then finally, I wanted to mention my, well, I guess you're already here. So my YouTube channel, but there's other tutorials here on neuroanatomy and segmentation, so that could be helpful to watch when you're watching, before you watch this tutorial, to get a bit more familiar with all these regions. So first I want to start by giving you an overview of the process of QCing T1-ASHS. So I would actually first start with QC of the MRI scan, because if the MRI scan is no good, the automated segmentation is also not going to do a good job. So once you establish that the MRI scan is good enough, I would recommend starting with checking the screenshots that are being automatically produced by ASHS. And I'll show some examples of those later on. So that's just a very easy way to quickly assess whether or not segmentation is good enough or is really bad. So then you can include or exclude. And what actually happens often is that you see some errors, but you cannot really establish well enough if the segmentation is good enough to include or not. So then I would recommend QCing it in ITK Snap or any other software that you want to. And then just really scroll through the image and further look into whether or not this is good enough. And then finally, and this is dependent on what you want to do, you could, if you establish there's a significant error, you can either include or exclude or edit the error that you've identified. And then generally, I would not exclude, although there are some cases, of course, where you find out while editing that it's just too difficult and you have to exclude that case anyways. All right, so for each of these steps, you can make decisions per hemisphere or even per subregion. So for example, you can say we're keeping everything except left hippocampus. That could be an option. And then I also wanted to mention that from left to right, from step 2 to 4, the QC is becoming more fine-grained. I guess you could technically also stop after just 2 if you feel that's sufficient for you to establish if you want to include or exclude, and if maybe a very large data set, you could stop there. So I personally oftentimes I have a hard time making a decision just based on the screenshot, and I do really want to check it in a little bit more detail. But I guess the amount of time you spend on step 3 or 4 really might depend on the sample size, uniqueness of your data set, or it's another option is a potential bias in segmentation error. So I guess if you have a really big sample, you might not want to do 3 or even 4 in too much detail. So maybe you would just stop at 3. But if you have a very unique and special data set, maybe you want to go all the way to 4 and do some extensive editing. And then I finally want to say if there's potentially a bias in your segmentation error, and I'll also come back to that later, then maybe you do want to add it even if you have a large sample size. But that, I guess that really depends on your study design and your sample. So then which files to select? I would say use gray, there's different files that ASHS outputs. There's use gray, no gray, and heuristic. So use gray is, you would only use that when your atlas set from the ASHS atlas set comes from the target data set. So it's developed based on the same data set that you then want to do your analysis in. In all other cases, you would use no gray. But if you're an outside user and you've downloaded ASHS T1, it would be no gray. Could be worthwhile to check heuristic if you're not completely happy with the no gray output and see what that looks like. All right, so then the first part of QC is the QC of the MRI, and the rule of thumb is that you need to be able to see the boundaries that you need for segmentation. It's actually very simple. So I show here two T1 MRI scans, and then I do a bit of a zoom in on the medial temporal lobe. And here on the MRI, you can see all the borders that you would be interested in. So you can see the gray matter borders with the white matter and the cerebral spinal fluid with some adjacent gray matter structure. So this would be good enough. And then in the right example, it's hard to see anything. So that would be an exclusion, I think, for me. And I did want to mention, and I'll also hopefully repeat that later on, is that we're really mostly looking at the outer borders of these MTL regions, medial temporal lobe regions with white matter and cerebral spinal fluid. That's what you need to see, and not maybe necessarily the border between hippocampus and entorhinal cortex, because those are not visible on MRI, and those are generally based on segmentation protocols. We have a rule for where we would put that border. All right, so then I will show you some examples. So here is the first example. So if I would scroll through, and if we, for example, look in the left hemisphere on the right side of the screen, I just want to show that I can see the border here. I'm just outlining what I'm interested in. I mean, obviously, when I would do QC, I wouldn't do it, but I'm just showing you with these outlines what I'm looking for. So then go to another slice. Let's see what we're interested in. Then, for example, a little bit further along. So, but of course, I would just assess this in my head. I wouldn't be drawing it. But yeah, this one looks good. I can clearly see the borders that I'm interested in. So I would include this subject. And then I want to quickly show this image is actually the same subject, but I wanted to mention that what I just showed was the raw MRI, and what I show here is the upsampled super resolution image, which is actually the one that is being created by ASHS. So I just want to mention that there's a difference between the two. So you're aware of this, and you will see these as well in the screenshots that I'll be showing later on. So then here I have a second example. What I kind of want to show is mostly the right hemisphere shown on the left side of the screen. And I hope you can see that there's not a lot of detail here. So there should be a campus here, but it's kind of hard to see. This should be entorhinal cortex, but there's in general not a lot of contrast here. This is a case with severe atrophy in that particular hemisphere. I don't really see these cortical regions very well, and it's on a number of slices, so I would probably exclude this case, or at least this hemisphere for this case, just because it's hard to see the borders that I'm interested in. So for entorhinal cortex, it would be hard to see where you would maybe draw the borders. Yeah, so this would be a case where I would potentially exclude one hemisphere. And then I have a third example, and you can already see there's some lining artifacts, so there's some motion in this case. And while maybe here it's not even as bad, I mean, it's not great in this particular slice, but there's potentially still see some of what you want. Sorry, this is a bit, the drawing is a bit messy. Then if you go further anterior, you can see it becomes very grainy, it becomes very difficult to make out what we're even looking at. So this is probably also an exclusion. And I would not necessarily exclude a case if it's bad on just one slice, but if it's bad on quite a number of slices, then that's definitely a reason for exclusion. All right, so then let me go back to the slides. So then I just wanted to go over the labels of ASHS, T1-ASHS. So we have anterior and posterior hippocampus, and we have the cortical regions, entorhinal in light green, foramen area 35 and 36 in dark and light blue, and pericampal cortex in purple. So those are the regions we're interested in if there's, and those are the ones for which we would be looking for segmentation errors. But then there's also some other labels for the dura. It's in light pink and orange, but also kind of a miscellaneous label for the sulcus or some other cerebral spinal fluid spaces, which is white or brown. And those we're not interested in. So if you see segmentation error in those, that's not a problem. So we would ignore that. So then the first step that I discussed of how I do QC of T1-ASHS is the screenshots. So this is what they look like. And I would personally, generally look at the top and the bottom row. So I'd look for general overlap of gray matter borders with the segmentation. So just an example here. This is what I see. And then if I put the same outline on the segmentation, you can see it matches very nicely. So this would be a good segmentation. I do have to say that the one tricky part is the anterior hippocampus, as it's kind of hard to differentiate from the amygdala. But if you've seen enough cases, you would be able to, you get the hang of you get a better, how do I say this? You'll learn what the hippocampus looks like in these anterior slices, and you can assess much better if it's incorrect or not. But I have to say that generally, I've not seen a lot of errors in this anterior region of the hippocampus. But yeah, definitely something you'll get a better hang of over time if you've looked at enough of these images. So then the other thing that I specifically pay attention to is if there is cerebral spinal fluid space, so that's dark in these type of images between the cortex, in this case entorhinal cortex, and the dura. And I want to zoom in a little bit here. So here you see there's this dark appearing space between the cortex and the dura, and the segmentation picked that up correctly. And this is actually an error where there's this is actually something that goes wrong a lot of the time. So, or not a lot of the times, but this is a common error that occurs. So this is something to be specifically on the lookout for. And so, as I already mentioned before, there's not really a need to focus on borders between the subfields, because those are really based on the segmentation protocol. So it's not something you can see on the MRI, but you can of course do it, but I would not do it unless you are very familiar with the segmentation protocol and the rules that were used to determine these borders. And if you really want to do a very fine-grained QC, but I think normally it's okay to just assume those are okay. All right, so then I first want to give you, of course, an example of a good segmentation. So I would just check on the top the borders that I see, and then if it overlaps with the segmentations that I see, and I just put in the outline for the third column, and I think it looks good, and it actually looks good for all. So this would be a good segmentation. I would include this case, and I would not do any additional checks. So then I wanted to go over some typical small errors. So some things that you can see is, for example, in a border region here between light and dark blue. So this is broken area 35 and 36. You can sometimes see some voxels appearing in the other region from the adjacent region. Another small error is that what happens here, for example, so probably on the previous slides, we have this dark blue, broken area 36, then it disappeared, and this is still a little bit of remaining tissue that you, or remaining label that you see. Another example is the cyst here. So that's a cavity filled with cerebral spinal fluid within the hippocampus. That's actually quite common. And ASHS actually often labels that just as hippocampus. Technically, it should have a little hole in your segmentation, but these cavities are generally quite small. So if it is labeled as hippocampus, it's not really a big deal. And then here, there's some potential under segmentation sometimes where, for example, here there's a gap between this green label here and over there's a little gap. So in general, these errors are quite small, and these can be ignored, I would say. So what can be helpful is just getting familiar with your data set and identify these kind of small errors and then ignore them, of course. I would want to say with regard to the cysts, I'd say it's generally not a big problem unless maybe you have a very big cyst that continues over several slices. So then if that's labeled as hippocampus, you might want to do some editing. But yeah, mostly I would say it's not a problem. So then I also wanted to show you a complete failure. Well, I guess this is obvious. I wouldn't even know if this is where the MRI scan is. So then, of course, the action is to just exclude this case. I mean, you could, of course, also just figure out what's going on with this case and rerun it. But in this specific output, you cannot include in your data set. So now I wanted to go over 3 typical errors that I've observed with T1-ASHS. So the first one is the hippocampus label in the ventricle that you can see here with the red arrows. You can see that there's actually, if you look in the top row, there's just ventricle. But then in the bottom row, you can see there's a lot of hippocampus labeled there, and it actually often kind of picks up a little bit of this grayish stuff in the CSF, and that's the choroid plexus. So yeah, the action would be to check this in more detail. And I want to mention that this is actually a common error in cases with more atrophic hippocampi. So when there's actually a lot more ventricle to see, this happens more often. And this is important to know, because if you were to exclude all these cases, you might create a bias, because then maybe you would be excluding more cases of your patient group. So that's something to be thinking about, whether or not you want to exclude or maybe edit these kind of cases. So if you would check in ITK Snap, what I would do is scroll through the image, turning the segmentation on and off, and focus on the overlap of the segmentation borders with the borders observable on MRI. Would only focus on the subregion for which you identify the potential error in the screenshot. Would determine a rule for in or exclusion, and for example, if there's a significant error on X number of slices. And again, there's no need to focus on the borders between subfields unless you're very familiar with the segmentation protocol or rules and want to do very fine-grained QC. So with regard to editing, which I'll also show, I would only edit the subregion for which you identify the significant error, and only on the slice in which you identify the error. So now I want to show another sample. I'll remove some of these windows. Load the image. So it's actually also nice to, in this case, look 3D. So if we look at the 3D model, everything outside here should not have been labeled. So by seeing that, you can see that there's such a big chunk of over segmentation that this would already be an exclude just based on looking at this 3D view. And if you go through it, you can see that it's indeed a big error. So you would either exclude or edit. And editing is actually quite easy. So you want to do clear label over red in this case. You just remove the label that's outside, and then of course also for the green. Remove that, and then you would go in on every slice and remove it. I'm not going to do all of that now, but just so you get an idea. So this is actually also quite an easy fix. So I would personally actually recommend editing. And if I fix it, yeah, you can already see I removed a part of this. So yeah, so that's how you would deal with this kind of error. So then of the same error, I have another example here. And this is actually a much more subtle error. So I zoom in here, you can see maybe a little bit of these green voxels. I do have to say, I'm not, just based on this image, I'm not 100% sure that this gray line here is the lateral part of the hippocampus or choroid plexus. So in case you're uncertain, I would just recommend checking this out in ITK Snap. So I will also show this example in ITK Snap. So if we look in 3D, you can see that there's hardly anything there even. I don't see a dot, like something outside, so that already indicates that it's probably a small error. But you can see, and it's this that we're looking at. So that's right on the choroid plexus. If I press S, I turn the segmentation on and off. So that shouldn't be there, but it's just on 4 slices. It's very few voxels, so I would say this is not a problem. I would include this case and not even edit probably. So here, a potential rule for inner exclusion could be include if the label outside the hippocampus is only a few voxels, say 5 or less, on a small number of slices, say 4 or less. This is just an example. You don't need to actually take this particular rule, but that could be an example. And I actually did edit this case, but then I found that it will only change volume by 0.5%. So that's not a lot that you're gaining here by editing. So yeah, I think it's probably not worthwhile. All right, so then I'm moving on to the next example of the kind of larger typical errors, and that is lateral undersegmentation of the hippocampus. This can be easier to see in the sagittal plane. So actually, I should have mentioned it before, but the first 5 screenshots are in the coronal plane, the last 2 in the sagittal plane, and it can be easier, but not always. And this is actually a common error in cases with healthier, fuller hippocampi that kind of touch the ventricle wall. And again, this could be another example where if you would just exclude all these cases, you could have a bias in your exclusion. But that's something to take into account. So what are we looking for? This is quite subtle, although I guess in the sagittal plane in this particular case, it's very clear. But then I also show the zoom in. So here you can see that the hippocampus really touches the ventricle wall, but then it should have been segmented much bigger. So here again, I want to show you the example in snap. All right, that's main image. All right. And this one I would actually check in the sagittal plane, but I first wanted to show you the 3D view. It's not super obvious from the 3D, but I guess it's a little bit flatter here, like the lateral part of the hippocampus. All right, so now I'm gonna look in the sagittal plane. So I'll move it over a little bit. Okay. So here the segmentation should have been a little bit bigger. Here as well. It's a bit hard to see, but I will just quickly check. I'm guessing this is also part of the hippocampus. So let's see in the coronal plane. Yes, that would be part of the hippocampus. All right. So yes, so this whole chunk is actually missing. This chunk is missing. Same here. So you can see that really a lot is missing in this case. So on actually quite a large number of slices. So that would mean that I would probably either exclude or recommend editing. And I actually wanted to come back to editing with the next case. So for now, I'll just go back to the PowerPoint. All right. So a potential rule for inner exclusion could be in this kind of error if a significant portion of the hippocampus label is missing on 5 or more sagittal slices. And that was the case actually for this example. So I would exclude or edit. So now I want to show you a second example of this kind of error. And here actually I would say it's quite obvious in the coronal plane. You can see like a huge chunk is missing. It's not as obvious in the sagittal plane, although I guess I would see a little bite out of the hippocampus label here. I have to say it really depends on where these screenshots are taken. So you cannot count on if the sagittal plane in this particular screenshot looks like that. It would still look nice if you would go further lateral. So yeah, I want to show you this example as well. And I actually wanted to show you the 3D first. So here it's a bit more easy to see actually in the 3D, where you can really see there's a bite kind of taken out of the hippocampus. So yeah, let's check that out in the sagittal plane, but you can kind of see this should all have been segmented. This should be segmented and so on. So that's again quite a large chunk that is taken out of it. And then not until here. So again, this was the screenshot we saw on the PowerPoint, but then one slice further lateral, you can already see a larger chunk missing. So don't just count on the screenshot, but really check it out if you see some portions missing in the coronal slices. So here, say that that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I would say, yeah, 10 slices on which there's quite a bit missing. So that would be reason to either exclude or do a editing. And the editing, I would actually, well, let me show it like this. I would do in the coronal plane. And what I would maybe do here, and I'm just taking this yellow label because I don't think we're using it, but I would actually start the editing in with another color. I would say only add labels when where there's no label, so yellow over black. So what I would do is I would add the label on all the slices where it's missing. And the reason why I would maybe pick another label now is because then it becomes easier to check in the other planes and then to see if it still looks okay in, for example, the sagittal or axial plane. And then you can make sure that you're only editing and removing stuff again. If you're not super happy with the yellow label, you can remove it, but then you can make sure that you're not touching any of the other colors. And then, of course, once you're happy with your segmentation, I would say start in the coronal plane and then in the end, kind of quickly check in the sagittal and the axial plane if you're happy with it. And when you're happy with it, you can then change the yellow to the correct label. So then you would change it to green. And then I actually think there was one slice, yes, where it's missing here, and then you would maybe not know necessarily what color it is, but I think here I would probably make this adjacent to the green label green, and then adjacent to the red label red. And this is, I think, the tricky part of this editing. So what I would do is I would first edit where you're really certain it's green and where it's really certain it's red. And then for the kind of the border regions, I would take a bit of a closer look. Although I have to say, generally, it's only, there's not that many voxels that are really difficult to determine. And then when we're just talking about a handful of voxels where you're not sure if there's green or red, I would say don't spend too much time on it. Just assign them one color. Because in this case, you could also, for example, make this lower one green. That would also look reasonable, but then it's just one voxel, so there's no point in spending too much time on it. All right, so that was another example here. And then I have a final example here. And here again, in the coronal plane, I see some reason to believe there might be lateral undersegmentation, but I don't see it in the sagittal plane. So I guess just to be sure, I would want to check this out. So yes. And then again in 3D, yeah, maybe I see a little chunk here, but it's not super clear. So I would look in the sagittal plane. See maybe a little bit missing here, but it's not too much. Again, here, something missing. Again, it's a small error here. Here it becomes a little bit bigger because it's just over the full length here. This would be maybe could have been segmented a bit bigger. And then this one. Yeah, so but that would only be 3 slices where it's really a bigger error relatively, and this 2 slices is already smaller. So I'd say in this case, I would probably include and not do any edits or anything else. All right. So then going to the third type of error, and this one is, I think, the most tricky. and that is over-segmentation of the entorhinal cortex. And again, I mentioned that I always look if there's space between the dura and the cortex, and if that is correctly picked up by the segmentation. So if there's actually a brown label where you want it to be, and in this case, in each of these four screenshots, there's this kind of CSF space, and it's correctly picked up with a brown label. So this would be an example of a good segmentation. But then here I have another example, and here this is maybe a bit hard to see, so I'll show a zoom in. So here maybe you can see that the green label here in the sagittal plane, it looks like there's some dark areas under it, so that should maybe have been segmented as cerebrospinal fluid. And here in the see the black outline of what is actually the cortex, and then you can see that a chunk of green is sticking out. And I'll show this in isogenated snap in a second, so it becomes a bit more clear. But what I did want to say is also that I often also check in the sagittal plane, because there you can see also if it's in a number of slices. So that's also a good indicator if you need to look further. So maybe you think this is such a small error, does that really matter? So what I did is for this slice, I checked the actual thickness of the cortex, which was 1.18 millimeters, versus the thickness of the segmentation, which was 3.23 millimeters, and that was a difference of 34%. So that's actually quite a large difference, especially if you would be looking at thickness measurements, but in general, that's a big difference. So yes, this could potentially be a problem, or this is a problem, and you would want to check this further and either exclude or edit if we determine that this is a problematic case. So then I want to look for the next example. Yes, and then the segmentation. And this one I actually checked in the coronal plane. So here is what I would be looking at. So if I look at the cortex, this would be more or less the outline, but you can see a large chunk of green is sticking out, and maybe on the other end it's a little bit missing, but this is clearly incorrectly segmented. And then same for the next slice. Same for the next slide. So that's actually happening for quite a number of the slices. It's sticking out. It's incorrectly segmented. It's not so bad here, I would say. I think generally more posterior you get, the better it does. But then, yeah, those anterior slices, it can be quite off. And what you can see here even is that it's even in the dura. So it's not just over segmentation in the cerebrospinal fluid that we're looking for, but also in the dura. But yeah, it's actually off on, I would say, quite a number of slices. So in this case, I would either say exclude or edit. So if you were to edit, I would say you want to first maybe select the clear label over the entorhinal cortex label. Oh, let's try that again. And then you would want on each slice to go in and remove the one that you remove what you want to remove, and then you can add if something is missing on the other end. Maybe now I will first add, and then I will switch back to the other one. And Yeah, so you would do that on every slice that you think the error is big enough, and then yeah, that's how you would fix this case. All right. Then yeah, potential rule for in or exclusion here could be if there's significant oversegmentation of the entorhinal cortex on 4 or more slices. Again, this is just an example. You don't need to use this, but this is just an example of how you could make sure that you're systematically, or at least in a consistent way, assessing all these cases. And as I already mentioned, note that oversegmentation of the entorhinal cortex can also include the dura, not just cerebrospinal fluid. And here I show another example where I don't really see an issue in the coronal slices, but in the sagittal plane, I see here like a long line of cerebrospinal fluid, but that's not really reflected in the brown segmentation here, like the brown segmentation of the cerebrospinal fluid. So here I would want to just check just to be sure that this is okay. And again, I do this in the coronal plane. As you maybe noticed, I ignore everything else. I'm just looking at the entorhinal cortex, and I generally don't look in those first few slices, but then here, a little bit over segmented here, but that's okay, I think. Same here, maybe I would remove a few pixels, but it's just a very small error. Here, I would say, well, actually, I'm over segmenting a little bit, yeah. It might be a little bit under segmented on that end, but it's hard to see. Yeah. I would say maybe a little bit more could have done, but these are still quite small errors. Yeah, here it's a little bit more. I would say here it's a little bit more clear that that should have been removed. I'm not always so precise now with outlining, as you've already seen. Yes, so here. So I think I've now identified a few slices where there's a little bit of an error, but I would say nothing maybe too serious. So I would probably not exclude this case, although it's yeah, I guess this is always the hardest type of error for me because it's really hard to determine what is really a significant error, how many slices is it. So this is definitely the one that gives me the most headaches. But yeah, I think this is good enough. Then I want to go back to this slice just to check if it's okay. I think, yeah, I think that is okay. It's maybe a little bit intersegmented, but it's just a few pixels. Sometimes it can also be a bit hard to see the gray matter border. So on some slices, I mean, yeah. So I would say this is not such a huge error, and I would not exclude this case. All right. So then there can be some other errors. So, for example, sometimes it happens that a case has very severe atrophy, and then it can happen that there's still segmentation in this specific area. So then it's over segmentation of Rodman area 35 and 6. So there's clearly light and dark blue label in the silk as well. There's no gray matter. This is not very common, but it can definitely happen in cases with severe atrophy. So I just want to make the point that you should not just be looking out for the 3 errors that I mentioned, but also for other kinds of errors that might be specific to your data set. So then before you start QC, I would say familiarize yourself with the data. So you get kind of familiar with what your data looks like, what the small errors are. And if you're doing QC with multiple people, you really want to be sure that you have good between rater reliability. So you need to go over a number of cases together before starting QC. Maybe each of the raters does the same 30 cases, and then you can convene and see if you came to the same conclusions. You want to decide on these rules for in or exclusion beforehand, so you're deciding this on the same rules. And you could, for example, also discuss difficult cases together at the end. So to summarize, the process of QC that I use is starting with the T1 MRI and looking at the screenshots for the ASHS, then look at ITK SNAP for cases where you want to check a little bit more in detail if it's okay or not, and then dependent on your study design, you could also do editing. Then I showed 3 common errors with T1-ASHS. One is the hippocampus label outside the hippocampus. One is lateral undersegmentation of the hippocampus, and one is oversegmentation of the entorhinal cortex. And I will also have a T2-ASHS QC tutorial that I can hopefully upload soon. And here the process is largely similar, but T2 has higher res, so you can see more, and that gives some unique challenges and things that you need to look at. All right, well, thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful, and I hope to upload a new tutorial on T2-ASHS QC soon. Bye.